As we go into this panel on what's been done in California, it's my honor to introduce the Honorable Assemblyman Eduardo Garcia from the 56th District, which covers Imperial and Coachella Valleys in far southern California. He's been a very effective leader in authoring and shaping legislation to defend the environment, labor rights, and environmental justice. He chairs the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies, played a key role in SB 32 with Senator Fran Pavley, which set Californians' overall GHG emission reduction goals for 2030, and was the author of the landmark AB 398 in 2017, which extended California's cap and trade system through 2030 and really included an important part on workforce and acknowledged that we can't get there unless it works for working people. So with that, I'll hand it over to Assemblyman Garcia. Thank you.
Testing. Here we go. Good morning. Happy to be here at UC Berkeley. I was telling our friends that this is probably the closest it'll come that being able to attend UC Berkeley campus for something valuable. But thank you. I'm happy to be here with the distinguished group of panelists where we'll be discussing the future of labor and economic opportunities for our workforce here in California. As was mentioned, thank you UC Berkeley Labor Center for bringing us together. Without a doubt, your research, your information really leads a lot of the policy-making decision when it comes to really making our case that this is the right way to go, the direction that we need to follow, not just in the interests of the global climate conversation, but for people in California. And really, that's at the center of why I've decided to engage into this space of public policy making. My name is Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia, State Representative, as was mentioned, for the 56th District, representing Imperial and Coachella Valleys. As was mentioned also, I was fortunate enough to be part of a number of different conversations related to these important landmark decisions, and both directly and indirectly working with many of you who are here in this room. Many of you know my district because of the problems that I continuously raise as it relates to the Salton Sea, living next to the Mexican border, and of course the annual Coachella Music Festival. Yeah, I thought you would know that. Carlos is in charge of taking names for tickets. He's right there in the front, and so I think he does charge 10% on top of whatever the tickets cost. But on a much more serious note, you know, my district is also home to some of the highest unemployment rates in the state of California. On a bad day, 1 in 4 of my constituents are not employed. To put it into kind of a better context here, in 2014, when we arrived to the state legislature, the unemployment in Imperial County was 26%. Today, we are not celebrating or jumping out of our seats, but it is at a low 16%. We've got much work to do still. And so, and those who are working are still struggling to make ends meet. So that kind of gives you a scenario of what the circumstances are in our backyard. That's why, and with much of the work and collaboration with many of you, we wanted to make sure that Assembly Bill 398, the extension of the cap and trade program, included language directing the Workforce Development Board to provide the legislature with recommendations on how we could help ensure workers would benefit from our climate change policies as we're looking at a new and cleaner economy for California and lead the way in the US. Reducing emissions is about meeting targets and cleaning our environment, but the foundation of that strategy must be economic transition. And that transition must be done in partnership with labor and technical experts to ensure our workers and communities don't get left behind. That's why I'm pleased to be here with you today and to be joined by a great panel of experts to discuss the role of labors in shaping California's climate policies. Cesar Diaz has been the Legislative Political Director for the State Building Construction Trades Council since 2010 and had previously served as Deputy Legislative Director for the Council since 2006. The State Building and Construction Trades Council represents approximately 450,000 construction workers across California who belong to 180 individual local trades. As Legislative Director, Cesar manages the council's legislative agenda to ensure its priorities are advanced. Cesar is also responsible for monitoring state regulatory agencies that may impact his members. With us, please help me welcome Cesar. I'm going to introduce the other panelists, and we'll get right in. And just so you all know, there will be someone walking around taking questions, because we do want to spend a good time taking questions from all of you as it relates to this conversation. The next person I'll introduce is Sarah White. She's the Deputy Director for Equity, Climate, and Jobs at the California Workforce Development Board, where she is charged with aligning the state's jobs and training agenda with its climate and environmental goals. Sarah's work focuses on the intersection of labor, education, and climate policy at a state and federal level, and she is a national expert on jobs and training in the clean energy economy. Sarah has written widely on inequality, decarbonization, and social change. Please help me welcome Sarah this morning. Cecilia Estolano is with Estolano LeSar Advisors, and she is the foremost expert on contemporary urban planning issues, ranging from economic and workforce development to land use, environmental equity, and urban revitalization for cities and communities across the country. During her nearly 30-year career, she has worked directly with public, private, and nonprofit clients to plan, finance, design, and implement and operate policy-driven programs and projects that promote sustainable solutions tailored for each community. Please help me welcome Cecilia. That's right. She is a UC board regent and also has served on the college board of governing. So that's right. Carol Zabin directs the UC Berkeley Labor Center for Green Economy Program. Dr. Zabin is a labor economist and an expert in low-wage labor markets, labor standards, and workforce development. Over the last 10 years, she has authored numerous reports on labor and California climate and energy policy for the California Utilities Commission, the Labor Agency, and others. She serves on the California Workforce Development Board and has consulted for state agencies, elected officials, unions, foundations, and many other community organizations on strategies and policies to improve jobs and skills in the green economy. She is the lead author on the workforce report mandated by AB 398, which will provide recommendations to the legislature on workforce and job strategies related to California's climate policies. Please help me welcome her. So, to the panelists, and we'll take it in the order that we were introduced. We have passed legislation, thanks to the leadership of our Senator Kevin De Leon, Senate Bill 100, that now sets a target for us. Really, the question that I have, and a question that comes from many people in the district that I represent and other inland parts of the state, is: does SB 100 mean that we continue to do more of the same, or do we look at it from a much more constructively critical perspective to determine how best we can train workforce for a much more sustainable employment opportunity in parts of California that suffer from double-digit unemployment rates? So let's start off with the question of SB 100, and where do we go from here?
Cesar Diaz with the State Building Trades. I just want to thank the UC Berkeley Labor Center, Carol Zabin, Rob Collier for this great opportunity. It's an honor to be here to discuss not only SB 100 and that historic bill, but also the previous accomplishments of climate change policy and how labor, especially the building trades, have played an integral role in making sure that those policies passed and got the necessary votes through the legislature. But not only passed, but also shaped the policy to ensure that a lot of the things that we're talking about here, as it consists of a good quality job, are actually attached to those policies. And we're talking about unemployment rates in your district, Assemblymember, and thank you for your leadership for your area that is rich in a lot of these resources, but has yet to see some of the great benefits of the sort of economy that goes into green economy and jobs. And that is not for a lack of trying, it's just that we are looking to places to build, and there are different opportunities. You presented different bills this year that we supported, and I think we're going to be consistent in trying to make sure that there's salt and seed restoration and that there's geothermal development in your area so that we can attract a lot of those job opportunities for those residents that you represent. We have been actively shaping this policy, and that policy has actually been the cornerstone in these terms of the renewable portfolio standard that has benefited California, not only in its GHG reductions, but also in ensuring that there's great paying jobs. That didn't just start with SB 100, it didn't start also with the RPS and the reductions. I see a lot of our affiliates here that have played a big role, from the IBEW, sheet metal, to iron workers, to the head of building trades councils, that have helped us get into places, elected leaders that look towards these policies and tie them, and to make sure that they create those job opportunities. When we were suffering through the Great Recession, we were experiencing 50% unemployment in the building trades. There was a lot of suffering, a lot of our members lost their homes, there were a lot of divorces, there was even a lot of suicides. It was the policy of renewables that actually kept a lot of our members working. They may not have been working full time, but a lot of these projects actually provided those economic opportunities during those very lean times. And so what we have done since then is double down on that policy and double down on the actual workforce training. So since 2000, not only dealing with natural gas and cleaning natural gas fire plants, then combining that with renewable projects, utility scale renewable projects, the building trades under project labor agreements that include hiring of veterans, women, and actually people of color from those communities that those projects are actually built in. We have built 36,000 megawatts, an investment of over $59 billion, 98 million work hours since the year 2000. That is massive. I will stop there because there's a lot of other workforce development opportunities that we have, and I think Sarah can elaborate on that.
Yes, please.
I'm good? Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. I think the answer to SB 100 is the answer to all of the climate policy and legislation. So let me talk a little bit about the state's vision of this. And we've heard this morning, from President Trumka and from Sharon Barrows about the international and the national call to action. And I'm very pleased to be part of the California call to action around this, because what it doesn't say in my bio is that I am a refugee from Scott Walker's Wisconsin. So we were the dry run for what's happening now around the country. And so I'm delighted to be here among friends. And the work that we're doing here in the Brown administration and to be continued in the new administration is based on a single premise, that the economic benefits of the low carbon economy need to be shared with the workers who are designing it, building it, and running it. That is the answer. That's what we mean by shared prosperity. That's what we mean by putting California on the high road. And that's a message that we'll be sharing tomorrow also at the Climate Summit. So I'm gonna say a little bit about some of the work we've been doing as a state board and the labor agency, and really across the administration, to align a comprehensive jobs and workforce plan with the climate plan. Our high road jobs and climate plan is not about rainbows and unicorns and fake green jobs, right? It is a set of intentional strategies and policies to ensure quality jobs, to make sure that access to those jobs are shared broadly with folks who have been in the past excluded from opportunity, and to building a stronger and more diverse labor movement. Carol asked me to say a little bit about the high road. I think in this room, people know what the high road is, but we have lots of different definitions of it, right? And it looks sometimes like labor management partnerships, and it looks like a suite of interventions in the labor market, and it looks like an approach to economic development and a way of sorting firms, and high road is a way of describing a world fit to live in. But if I could talk for a moment, not as a representative of the Brown administration, but say how we talk about the high road back in Wisconsin. The way you know it is when you're on it. Because if you look around and you see people treating workers like roadkill and the earth like a sewer, you can be pretty clear, my friends, that we're on the low road. So we are here in California on the high road, and I'm delighted to be a part of that. The high road is based among firms and their labor partners who capture the value and the skill of their workforce, who invest in their workforce, and by capturing the value of that, that is what you compete on. It's a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And our definition at the state board and at the labor agency of the high road adds a sustainability quotient, because that's the future, as we've heard, it's here, and also a really clear equity component. And what I want to say about the equity component is that there's a lot of talk in California about equity and certainly relationship to climate. But for us, we're very clear that you cannot get to equity without job quality, and that you cannot get to job quality without unions. So that's our vision. So yeah, so we keep saying that over and over again, and we are committed to putting California in the high road. And this is, again, simultaneously advancing equity and mobility for workers, skills and competitiveness for the state's best employers, and addressing the challenges of climate change throughout the economy. And this commitment is a commitment to delivering job quality, not through just a few workforce training programs, but across California's billions and billions of dollars of climate investments. And we do this in 3 ways. One of the things that we will talk about further today is Mr. Garcia has asked us to prepare, as you've mentioned, a report for the legislature and an action plan to be released by the year's end. But we're also, this work is already underway in our work with the climate and energy agencies. We are intentional about this work. There's a lot of calling for inclusive economic growth, and that really presupposes that good jobs will emerge as a co-benefit of climate initiatives. But we know from a decade of experience that it is not enough to promise job creation, that states have to use their public investments to intentionally build quality jobs and accessible pathways into them. And when I say job quality, I mean a very specific thing. There's also now, I don't know whether to be pleased or alarmed that people are all talking about job quality, which is great, but we mean not just high wages, right? We mean that decent wages for working families, paid time off, health and retirement benefits, fair scheduling and contracting, access to training and advancement, worker voice on the job site, and no new sweatshops masquerading as independent contracting. So these are the kinds of things that we say when we say job quality. And I'm very pleased to be saying that as a member of the Brown administration and not as an outsider pushing for these things. So we're very excited to be carrying this message. For the first time, the state is developing an integrative, comprehensive jobs and workforce plan to go along with the comprehensive climate plan, and that these two are going to be bound together. And this high road plan is based, let me say, on a vision of labor as an investment rather than labor as a cost. So people usually expect me to talk about workforce, and one thing I'll say is that we don't need 1,000 tiny training programs based on what someone in Sacramento thinks might be the future of green, right? We've tried that already. So to CARB and to CEC and to all of our sister agencies, we suggest that maybe not so involved in the workforce training, right? You're not workforce agencies. The way that you can really add value to this proposition is by attaching labor standards to the money that's going out the door. And we're developing a suite of strategies, and intentional demand-side strategies to make sure that that happens. They look like things that you're familiar with. They look like PLAs and community workforce agreements and best value contracting and the U.S. Employment Plan and Manufacturing, any number of ways, so that across sectors and industries there's the same approach to getting job quality on the money going out the door. And then we talk about the supply side. Then we can start talking about how to build training pathways up to meet those quality jobs. But you always start with the jobs. You never start with a population that you want to see advance in the labor market. You have to start with the jobs and then connect folks to something. So that is our mantra at the state board. And we can talk more about what that looks like. I just want to say quickly, before I go on, there's 2 investments, in addition to working across state agencies to make these demand-side labor standards happen. The state board is invested in 2 demonstration programs, and one is the high road training partnerships, and I've seen a lot of folks in the room who are part of these partnerships. And what this is that wherever in the state that management and labor are working together across the economy to design climate mitigating approaches to work, we're going to invest in that. The state is investing in these labor management partnerships across a variety of industries, because I think it's important to say that every single job and every single industry is going to be impacted by climate change or is impacting climate change and environmental sustainability generally. We are investing in labor management partnerships that are addressing climate in hospitality, healthcare, transit, trucking, county services, building maintenance. We are thinking about frontline workers in hospitals and hotels, on electric buses and forklifts, in commercial buildings, in community clinics, in the public sector and private. You'll hear more about some of these today, but we don't have one picture of what the future of labor looks like in the low carbon economy. And also the other thing is that investing in these partnerships, we are saying it's a modest investment, $10 million at this point, but this is a high road approach that we're modeling, and we are saying to everyone else doing training in California, you want to do training, you want to make sure your supply and demand come together, you want an economy that supports working people. We have a model for that. It looks like a high road training partnership. So we're lifting up those partnerships, not just to invest in them so that they continue the great work they're already doing, but so that they can be a model for other partnerships in California. And the last thing is a suite of investments that we call high road construction careers, to build on what Cesar is talking about. This began in some ways with the work that we've done on Prop 39 and SB1 and beyond. We can talk more about what those are. But what we're really trying to build around the state is a comprehensive network of pre-apprenticeship partnerships that connect people to middle-class jobs in the construction trades. These are happening all over the state, but these partnerships we want to have be intentional and comprehensive, linking local building trades councils to workforce boards, community colleges, community-based organizations, and creating structured pathways around a multi-craft curriculum into state-certified apprenticeships. This work is happening all over the state. We are going to invest to make sure that is happening in a comprehensive partnership way rather than a lot of small investments chasing jobs. And I think one reason this is so important, and then I'm sure Carol will talk a little bit about this, is that the majority of the jobs that we've seen so far that are going to be critical to mitigation and adaptation are going to be jobs that are require more than a high school degree, less than a four-year college degree, and a lot of these are in construction. So organizing the construction sector and pre-apprenticeship pathways into certified apprenticeships is going to be a critical strategy for the state, and we're working on that as well. So I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Sarah. And we'll get back to some of the points that you made as it relates to equity, inclusive economic growth, because, I mean, those are the questions that people are asking in parts of the state of California that continue to experience 26% unemployment rates, right? And so we'll get back to that. Cecilia.
Thank you. So talked a lot about the state and some of the state policies driving down, but the reality is a lot of this stuff happens in cities. It happens in local communities. And many of the models that Sarah talked about actually got pioneered in cities. I come from Los Angeles, and I'm really here to talk about all the great work that Roxana, Tina, and Lane has done. But I'm only half joking in the sense that what has been critical to making these partnerships work politically is forging a powerful labor coalition, labor community coalition. And I want to give you a specific example in a field that we haven't talked about yet it is 20% of our energy use, and that's in water. And we're in the middle of it right now in LA. So LA, we're always in drought, everything's bummer, right? But what it doesn't rain very much, but when it does rain, it rains a lot. And we don't have a lot of storage for that water. We only recycle 3% of our water. We are also in a place on Santa Monica Bay that is quite polluted. And so we have mandates from the Clean Water Act to have to clean up what's going into our rivers, even if they are channelized, into our rivers and streams and into the ocean. So I'm going to tell you a story about clean water that's really about energy, that's really about creating construction jobs for low-income communities of color that lead to construction careers and operation and maintenance jobs in the public sector. I'm going to do that in 5.5 minutes. Okay, so clean water mandates, huge unfunded mandate. Lots of cities are really freaked out about it. They have to meet these clean water mandates for non-point source pollution, but there's no funding source, right? So a few years back, several years back, they made a run at trying to do a parcel fee, a countywide parcel fee, and the usual suspects were part of that coalition, basically traditional environmental groups and big engineering firms. Surprise, surprise, they failed miserably at the Board of Supervisors. They didn't have the political will to do it. They didn't have the political chops and the smarts to figure out a coalition. And so what happened is the conservative members of the Board of Supervisors literally bussed in opponents to speak against putting this on the ballot. Flip forward a couple of years later, a new client of mine, the Water Foundation, says, how do you think we could actually pull this off? And I could honestly say you will never get this accomplished unless you have labor and community at the table, like equity, like people of color. That is the only way you're going to get people in Los Angeles to tax themselves for something called non-point solution MS4 permits. Right. So what we have created with the backing of some philanthropy, but also really importantly, investments by the labor movement, which is stretched in a million different ways in Los Angeles, which is really the leading edge for all major public infrastructure investments. What we have is a coalition that put equity at the center of the debate. We reframe this about water resilience, not MS4 permits, but water resilience, drought prevention, clean water, reducing pollution and toxins in our poorest communities. And guess what? That polls really well. And then if you can combine communities of color that understand the need to remove toxins in the community and also want to have clean water and also get the sense that we can't just keep importing water all the time, we actually need to capture the rain that falls infrequently but importantly in our basin. If you combine that with the power of labor who can translate public investments into actual job opportunities for the communities voting for this. So that's the coalition that was built over about 2.5, 3 years. And it was a lot of work. So because I had to do this in 5.5 minutes, I'm going to cut to about the middle of the story, which is at the Board of Supervisors. A rally before the Board of Supervisors where you had Ron Miller, the head of the LA County OC Building Trades, standing there with Daryl Sarmiento from Communities for a Better Environment, all endorsing a parcel tax, which is going to be basically $86 per homeowner. And industry will also be taxed based on your impermeable surface. You don't have to understand this. The point is, this is what we're actually getting people to put on the ballot. And that tax is going to raise $300 million a year. That $300 million a year, there will be PLAs attached to it, project labor agreements, that will have local targeted hire requirements. There will also be a funding stream for training and pre-apprenticeships, specifically aimed at communities of color, workers at risk, folks that traditionally haven't had access to some of these jobs, to get them the skills ready to go so they can become a part of the construction that happens on these projects. It also has, importantly, some language around having to operate and maintain these stormwater improvements. And when I talk about stormwater improvements, again, I'm not going to go off into the water world because you guys are really not water people, but we're talking about a new approach to stormwater management that mimics the environment, right? So instead of just building a big treatment plant, which is a lot of jobs, but not so great for the environment, and it usually gets cited in low-income communities, what we're going to do is build more parks. We're going to take our existing parks and store water underneath them. So we're going to make green investments that will green our very, very brown communities that don't have open space, where you have lots of toxins, where kids don't have a place to play. These are also places that are massive heat islands, right? And are getting worse every year. So we will put this investment, we're going to clean the water, we're going to capture the water, we'll be able to reuse the water, and we'll make our communities cleaner, and we're going to create jobs for the folks who live there. And we've put in that language that communities who are traditionally underinvested in are going to get 110% of the investment. We're going to begin to try to address the historic underinvestment by putting more in those communities, more of the benefits in those communities. And we've included accountability measures so that labor, community, EJ folks have a seat at the table when we do the important work of what gets built, where does it get built, who benefits, who builds it, and who maintains it. Because for the first time in the water context, we're telling folks, you've got to actually have skilled workers maintain some of these grassy swales and green investments. It takes some skill. It's not a 4-year degree, but it's probably a community college training system. And that curriculum needs to be developed, and we need to get our graduates from LA Trade Tech into that, and then they can get a job in county public works with good standards and benefits. So that's the vision. We got 4 out of 5 votes on the LA Board of Supervisors to put that on the ballot in November.
Thank you.
So I think I'm over 5.5 minutes, and I can feel Carol getting anxious over here.
Doctor's ready to go.
So the thing that I want to really focus is, let's hope we pass, okay? Because this is tough. We got to get a 2/3 vote. We're asking people to tax themselves. Yeah, to tax themselves. It's polling pretty well, but we're not quite there. So if you want to make a campaign contribution, I'm sure one of us would take it. Measure W, LA County. But a few lessons, right? One is this coalition of community-based organizations, labor, and traditional enviros hung together for 2.5 years. And at the end of it, you had the head of Heal the Bay and the Santa Monica Baykeeper, the LA Waterkeeper, say, we need those labor standards. We won't support this unless those labor standards are in it. And you had, it's true. The flip side is you had the labor advocate from Lane say, we must have a nature-based solution. Lauren told me just the other day, I'm not exactly sure still what that means, but we need that, right? We must have a nature-based approach to stormwater management. They hung tight, and it mattered, because when they did individual visits to the members of the Board of Supervisors, one supervisor said, well, where's labor on this? And another one said, well, where's CBE on this? And they could honestly say, we hang together. We all agree this is the package we must have. So the bottom line on is, we can have ambitious goals. We can have ambitious goals of 100%, but we actually won't make it unless we build the power and the enduring coalitions, and we start to understand each other. Do I think that all the Greenies really understand why a project labor agreement is essential and exactly know the mechanism of pre-apprenticeships? I don't think they exactly know it, but I think what they did learn is it's not enough to say you're creating jobs. They have to have standards. And they started to understand for the first time that unions mean standards and good paying jobs. So that's what's gonna make it possible, Assemblymember, for your district to get the benefits. We have to build these enduring coalitions. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing what is, I think, a real-time situation, right, that has brought together this collaboration amongst folks who are understanding that without one or the other, right, we can't move this agenda forward. Measure W, right? Measure W. Win. No. Work, right? Water, that's right. Doctor, it's all yours.
Okay, well, I have the pleasure of closing up this panel, and what I'm going to do is really preview the wonderful work on the ground that unions are doing that will be described in the 8 sessions in this afternoon. Cecilia took a deep dive, and I'm going to talk about a lot of different on-the-ground industry approaches to what she talked about of both environment and labor. And I'm also going to focus on the industries that are going to change or maybe grow. I'm not going to focus on the industries that are in decline, because we have a whole panel about that critical issue next. So I just wanted to be clear about that. Before turning to examples, let me first describe how our climate policies work in California so we get an overview. Our climate action plan, which is called the scoping plan, lays out sector by sector how our economy has to change in order to squeeze enough emissions out to reach our 2030 targets. And the scoping plan has identified 6 sectors. The 3 big ones are energy, transportation, and industry, and the others are waste, water, and wildlands and agriculture. And so for each sector, there are multiple policies, and I counted almost 100 policies in the scoping plan. Some are big, like the Renewable Portfolio Standard or the Cap and Trade Program, and some are much smaller in scope, like supporting emerging technologies like offshore wind, or stricter building codes around lighting, or pilots for electric vehicle ride sharing for farm workers, or grants for alternative manure management for dairies to reduce poop management. And when you think of these, you think, well, that's kind of neutral in terms of their impact on workers. And sometimes Sarah and I have visited these, the agencies that implement climate policy, and they kind of go, what? You're talking about wages? And access, what do we have to do with that? And I think we're making the argument here that, you know, our economy produces a lot of low-wage jobs, and women and people of color and immigrants get stuck in them. So we have to look at every policy and see what jobs are impacted and see how we can modify or tweak or add labor standards or use other policy tools in combination with those climate policies to get better outcomes for workers. So now the examples. I think we've talked about how critical construction is. It's important for building rail and capital transit projects. It's important for renewable energy, energy efficiency. And in fact, over half of our cap and trade revenues have gone to construction projects. So that's key. And we have this whole suite of policies and labor standards and pre-apprenticeship infrastructure and apprenticeship infrastructure that really ensures job quality and job access. But there's other strategies that you'll hear about this afternoon. For example, in the energy efficiency panel, you'll hear about efforts by the Blue-Green Alliance and the IBEW to require skill standards in our over $1 billion of incentive money on energy efficiency programs in the state. And in the training panel, you'll hear how the IBEW and its employer partners have invested in all kinds of training for emerging technologies. And at the same time, the IBEW is investing in efforts to prepare formerly incarcerated workers to get into the trade. So at the top end of the highest skills for the most advanced technologies, but also preparing entry-level folks as well. Now, it's not just construction anymore. So in the manufacturing panel, you'll hear about the use of government procurement for the public good. Jobs to Move America and union partners have worked to ensure that the LA Transportation Agency buys electric buses from a company that has committed to labor standards and committed to hiring and training women, people of color, formerly incarcerated, vets, etc. You'll also hear about efforts to put some standards on our government rebates to electric car manufacturers, who now have to be certified as fair and responsible if they're going to be able to give out rebates to their car buyers. And those are generous rebates, $6,000, $7,000 per car. You'll also hear about really climate critical industries like public transit, like firefighting, like public health, where there actually are already good jobs and where unions are, one, taking leadership in training the next generation and making sure that that next generation reflects our population, but two, are really the key advocates for sufficient funding for those services. And the adaptation panel and others will address that. Then there are the more complicated efforts to restructure industries that have really been low road and that have also just externalized their environmental costs. And one of those is the waste industry. And again, Lane has done great work in LA to take a pretty chaotic municipal contracting process that's based on lowest bid and really shifted it to a much more organized, responsible contracting process that is increasing wages, investing in skills, and also is actually able to implement its waste diversion goals because it's a controlled, organized industry now. Another one you'll hear about is pretty intractable, which is trucking, right? Which is a really big emitter. And it's also, since deregulation, become a really low-wage industry. And there's parts of that industry, short-haul trucking that you'll hear about, where our climate efforts are actually we're obviously trying to improve our clean truck standards. And yet, because workers, truck drivers, are classified as independent operators, they're actually responsible for buying or retrofitting to make their trucks cleaner, and they are earning poverty wages. So it's not only inequitable, but it isn't working. So you'll hear about efforts to properly classify employees in order to shift the industry so that it can be cleaner, more efficient, and also more just. So then finally, there's the efforts that I call the kind of the grand bargains, and you kind of described one. There's other examples. Jeff Johnson in the next panel will describe his efforts, and I always want to give a shout out to that effort in Washington to kind of do comprehensive climate policy, whether it's about urban development in a big region like Los Angeles or a whole state where you get everybody at the table, you hash out the costs, the benefits, the trade-offs, you see how everything's interrelated, and you put forth a set of climate policies that are comprehensive. That's hard to do in California because we already have 100 policies on the books, but we're working on it at the local level, and hopefully...
That's Senator Kevin De Leon's fault. He did.
Right. So, so there's a lot of great examples you'll hear about. They're not just in California. They're around the world and around the country. And our task is to learn from these, to see what works and doesn't, to figure out how to scale up, and ultimately to develop a policy framework for climate action that works for workers in the coming years. So thank you.
Doctor, thank you so much. You mentioned, and we'll be collecting those cards to take some questions. I think we're here till about 11:20, 11:30 or so. But you mentioned that we'll be taking a deeper dive on some of these issues related to transition to specific areas of industry. But I want to mention something, and I don't usually find myself quoting Republicans on the Senate side of the California State Legislature. But let me quote Senator Fuller. And during the debate of the SB 100 policy, she says something to the extent, we are seeing a decline in the oil industry jobs. They're good paying jobs. They're located in our economically most disadvantaged parts of the state. And we're replacing them with solar construction jobs. And when that construction job is done, we've got maybe 2 people that are working on site where prior to that construction, you had hundreds of good paying jobs for what is most of the times people of color who represent and reflect many of the populations that you've mentioned, veterans, formerly incarcerated. And so, when you have Senator Fuller, I dare to say that we're no longer having the argument or debate if climate change is real or not. We're now talking about a just transition for the people that she represents, for the folks that I represent. I think the same idea is applicable to farm workers and the amount of jobs that are in place in our rural parts of the state where we would change land use policies and go from farm working the land to now a solar construction project. Not too much into it because I know there will be some panels specifically talking about that, but maybe you all have something that you can enlighten us about as it relates to that specific area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of at the heart of what we're facing here, right? It's how fast, how aggressive it's needed for the benefit of the environment, but where does that leave in terms of economic prosperity? A lot of these areas and a lot of those workers that are working in those industries. In the building trades, we represent people that actually work in the refineries. Yet we supported SB 32, we supported SB 350, and we've been behind all of those pieces of legislation. We want to see those refineries get cleaner, better, and have better technologies to emit less toxins into the air so that people that live around those communities, which are our members as well, have a better quality of life. With regards to that specific district, you look at policies that have been championed by the building trades, and it's really an honor just to sit here with this distinguished panel and listen to each one of them actually describe policies that are building trade specific, that we've championed, we've helped design, and at the local level, at the state level, really proud of that. But that actually is playing out in Senator Fuller's district, where high-speed rail is actually getting built. We have more than 2,000 workers right now building the transportation of the future that actually is going to reduce basically cars from being on the road. Those workers also have the opportunity not only to be exposed to the careers in construction through pre-apprenticeship programs that we've actually developed, but also in the renewable energy production that's going on in that area. The iron workers, the IBEW, the operating engineers, all of them are very much involved, and they're opening up their apprenticeship programs to put people to work on those projects. Out of the renewable energy, out of high-speed rail will come housing and community development around those train stations. And that's going to bring economic diversity to those areas where perhaps even Silicon Valley workers will be able then to travel back and forth, to Silicon Valley from the Central Valley, where it's actually more cost-effective for them to buy homes and so forth. And out of that comes schools and different types of opportunities. So I think we're looking at the long game, but also looking at the short game. In the short game, a lot of those workers are getting those opportunities.
Sarah, would you like to kind of chime in on that?
I'll take this one's working. I think that I think one of the point that Cesar is making is very, very important. I think that it's hard for folks who don't work in the construction industry to understand how it works, right? And it's very complicated. But I think the thing that we see is that you're talking about not connecting people to a job, but to a career, right? Over a course of a lifetime, which is connection to the building trades, which is going to be building. The trades are always measured in job hours, not specific jobs, but it's a connection. So we, especially like this in the pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship pathway, that we're talking about connecting people to middle-class jobs that would not have been accessible otherwise.
But Cecilia?
No, I think Sarah kind of covered it.
Doctor?
I also think it's important to be realistic that climate policy is not the only economic development policy that we can look at. I mean, if farm workers were paid well, those rural areas, including yours, Assemblyman, would be in a lot better shape. And I think what we have in the opportunity of climate policy is it is a policy-driven economic change. So that means that every policy we can look at and we can say, how do we make this better for workers? And we can also look, so that's kind of the short game. Every policy on its own can be improved and tweaked to make it better for workers. And then there's the long game, I think, that Cesar talked about, which is we really do need to do regional economic development strategy. Climate and greening is part of it. It's not the only part. We need to look at the kind of comprehensive costs and comprehensive benefits and make sure that the benefits aren't only going to affluent EV car buyers or solar rooftop owners and are spread out, and that the costs are important, aren't overly burdened on people who are, not in the top 5%.
I want to jump in one last thing, because we're talking about economic development more generally. I think Carol's absolutely right. So what some of the interventions that Sarah and Carol have talked about, we do it in the climate context. The important thing to know is there are going to be new tools for economic development. This governor removed redevelopment, right, and got replaced with some not very powerful tools. I think there's every expectation that there'll be something new happening, Assemblymember. And the thing that I would say is the interventions that we're putting in place in the climate plan, one of the most important things you could do as a member and a leader in the legislature is to make sure that the next governor takes those same framework and puts it into any economic development program. So Senator Fuller wants to take economic development dollars or use tax increment dollars, there will be standards attached to it, right? No more free money for sales tax chasing industries, right? We need to embed those same standards. in any new tune. And we talked about opportunity zones are coming down from the federal government. Those rules haven't been written, but California can shape the way that we use opportunity zones, and they should have both an environmental context but a labor standard context as well. It's absolutely essential.
Good. So that last comment, I think, addresses two questions that I was holding up in terms of how do we make that applicable across the board, that we're not just looking at our climate change policies, but also, as you just mentioned, the next administration apply that to any investment, public investment that we're making, that we uphold those types of standards as the high road partnership standards that was talked about here today. So those were a couple of the questions here. Someone wants to know about Tesla, and they asked a question about talking about labor standards. Who wants to kind of take a stab at that question?
But it will be addressed in the afternoon panel.
Yeah.
In detail.
Just
So we won't
give us-
go too deeply into it, but it's the question of, like, we're talking about, just transition and jobs, right? And we're talking about, okay, what is going to be described as a good job? And of course, we know a union job is actually a really great job. We understand that, but you all should know that we're also fighting against the very definition of what is employment in California. And so as we're fighting not only to include labor standards in public investments into the green economy, we're also fighting those same employers or same corporations who want to make everyone independent contractors. And that is very difficult. So we implore all of you who care about what a good quality job is, what a just transition is, to look at Tesla as one of the examples. That's a company that has profited greatly from a lot of public dollars, has created that model, and has, he's all over the TV and so forth, but yet a lot of these workers are in unsafe working conditions, are receiving poverty wages, and are living in the most expensive area in the entire state, if not the world. And so oftentimes those companies are also the same ones that want to put everyone into what's called the gig economy. I know that's going to be discussed later, but I cannot say that the Labor Federation has done a really great job at defending against that sort of pervasive sort of change from being called an employee to an independent contractor when you're truly an employee. And when they do that, they strip you of all the protections, including all the quality job standards that we're talking about here.
So we just had another Tesla question about the hazardous waste that is affiliated to that type of manufacturing, and we'll save that for the next panel. We have a question here as it relates to what other labor unions are involved in the development of these public policies, and perhaps Doctor, you're working on the report. Who else is collaborating with you on this front?
Well, as a researcher, I've been observing more and more involvement of other unions. Really, as we got to our 2020 targets already, but they weren't that stringent. The 2030 ones mean looking at a lot more sectors and a lot more industries. And so we are really expanding. And if you look at the panelists here, we have the utility unions, we have the auto workers, we have a bunch of manufacturing workers, we have the transit unions, we have public sector. What else? We have the Service Employees International Union. So, who are doing the Green Janitors Program. I think more and more, and I think internationally, you folks are seeing this too, as we move into these other sectors, and climate policy will affect them, then we get more and more unions involved.
Can we talk a little bit about land use policies and how AB 32, SB 375 really intended on making sure that we paid more attention to how we develop our communities? The question here is, how do we do so in a way in which we don't continue to perpetuate racialized communities being built and continue to suffer from low-wage employment opportunities in these areas that we're building out maybe
I'm going to jump in, and you guys, this is a particular issue of concern for me. So people talked about capturing the value of worker investments. When we talk about land use, we in government have one of the most powerful leverage points. That is land use regulation. And when we say we need to concentrate development in places that have high quality transit, where people can get around and they can get out of their cars, and then we allow folks to sort of upzone without capturing the value of that, and forcing and really making sure that the benefits of that additional development capacity accrues to the community, then we've lost an opportunity. So there's a different model. And actually, hate to keep talking about Los Angeles, but we are LA. The County Labor Federation, Rusty Hicks is going to talk about this in the afternoon panel, so I'm not going to talk about it too much other than to just give you a little thumbnail sketch. There was a effort, basically LA's been booming in the residential sector, right? But very few units of affordable housing have been built. So rents are going sky high. Real estate values are going sky high. And without any redevelopment and any way to kind of capture that value, basically it's all going to be luxury development, right? And so you have people being displaced. Meanwhile, we're investing like $120 billion in our transit system and rail, just a historic investment in rail. And we're basically building rail that's now going to be surrounded by high rent luxury apartments and condos. So the very people that would ride the rail, the low-income people of color, have been displaced. So naturally, you have seen this effort and a lot of concern and consternation as huge increased densities happening in many neighborhoods. Suddenly, a slow growth movement was starting to bubble up in Los Angeles. It's very cyclical, right? So the County Federation of Labor took a really proactive approach to this and said, okay, if you want to get a general plan amendment or a zone change in LA, great. If you want to do that, then you need to provide affordable housing at these income levels, and you need to actually hire local people, and 60% of your workforce, 60% of the work hours have to go to people who've completed a joint labor management apprenticeship. So, or you have to use the additional zoning. You have to use the existing zoning. Because what was happening in LA is the city council was just giving away all the density and getting nothing back in return. But they also did this other thing. It also called for a transit-oriented community ordinance to be adopted that kind of leverage, saying that if you're close to transit, then you have to actually, if you want to build more density, you have to provide certain kind of affordable housing at very, very low wages, very, very low incomes. Okay, so what's happened since that occurred? There was also a slow growth measure. In between those two measures being adopted, this was a campaign and initiative that won. Again, Labor Community Rent Control Affordable Housing Coalition won JJJ. And then there was a slow growth measure. In between those two times, 1,445 units of affordable housing has been built because of the JJJ measure. So that may not sound like a lot, but it's about $350,000 to $400,000 a unit to build affordable housing per unit. So just by taking a pro-community labor approach to capturing the value of increased density, Rusty Hicks and the County Federation of Labor saved the state of California about $400 million in affordable housing subsidy. That's the way that you do land use for climate, for equity, is you capture the value and you make the people that own the land or buy the land share that upside with the surrounding communities and with workers. So the people working on those construction jobs could actually afford to live there.
So in 3 bullet points, you are campaigning for Measure W. Someone here wants to know, what's the message? What's the message to pass Measure W and, of course, to replicate the partnership between the environmental community and labor groups as well? So,
Clean water, good jobs, resiliency.
thank you. We have about 5 minutes. We've got a couple questions here. A little bit about safety and OSHA and the role that they play as you roll out and implement a lot of these workforce development policies. Someone want to touch a little bit on kind of the perspective that you feel OSHA brings to the table in order to follow through with a lot of these expectations that are being put forward?
OSHA is one of the, health and safety is of course one of the critical standards along with wages, benefits, and others. And I think the point that we're trying to make is it's not enough to train people. You have to have the standard so that employers have to comply and make sure that the workers on the jobs are in fact trained. I mean, that's the short message, that the standards are as important as the training itself, because if you have those requirements, then employers will invest in the training and workers will get skilled up. It's not an add-on anymore.
Are there any ideas or suggestions on how we should measure the positive outcomes of these climate change policies above and beyond just GDP growth in the state of California? We talk about the number of jobs, we talk about the 5th largest economy in the world, and I hate to go back to this, but you know, when I go back to my district, I'm being told, but we still have 26% unemployment. So is there a different way that we begin to put barometers out there to measure whether or not we are truly being inclusive and applying our policies in an equitable manner? That's the question at hand.
I would like to just maybe look at the expansion of project labor agreements with community benefit agreements as they relate to what you're mentioning, and that is everything that's tied to public dollars. So there is investment in your community. There's schools, there's hospitals, there's roads, there's all sorts of public money that's going in there. Whether or not those dollars are actually being tied to help the people that live in those communities is how I think you can break through some of that, right? And if we're able to then create a network of project labor agreements with community benefits to ensure that there's local hire provisions to get women, veterans, people of color, people from those actual communities to work on the investments that taxpayers are paying for, that type of infrastructure, then I see that you can have that sustained employment where a person could enter an apprenticeship program, finish out their apprenticeship, journey out, and still be able to work in and around their areas and work on projects that are in their communities. And that's only going to be done if all the policymakers and all the electeds, whether they're Republican, Independent, Democrats, look at that investment and say, I'm going to maximize that. I'm going to use those public dollars, and I'm going to get the private companies that come in, and I'm going to actually have them buy into that policy as well. And I think that's going to be the way that you can get all those policies to get those benefits shown.
Cesar, I have a question here for you, and it has to do with kind of the rank and file and the buy-in statewide and maybe even across the country to the work that's being done here. But how do you do it in a way that you also are looking at areas of the state, and here it's talking about rural parts of California, to make sure that we're also paying close attention to these regions of California? Just talk a little bit about kind of your role in bringing leadership on board with the trades.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these investments are in, you're talking about infrastructure that's located where there's high density, right? And we're talking about development like SB 375. We're talking about housing policy that the legislature just passed that's going to create more job opportunities where there's transportation and other services. In construction in of itself, a lot of our members have to travel on average about 100 miles to and from the job site. It's a very tough industry to actually be in, right? Because you're not always working in your community. You're going to travel places, and you're often going to travel to where the actual jobs are. That's why it's imperative for us to create all of these angles and all of these policies to deal with energy, to deal with public works, to deal with commercial and residential, and to try to aggressively make those better jobs and union jobs so that our members can actually have that type of access. Some of our members actually choose to live in rural communities, right? They're very much into gaming, fishing, and other things like that. And so they all have that kind of mobility, but we want to bring that type of policy into the areas where they live so that we can also encourage more people from rural areas. We're talking about like in the Oroville Dam, right? A lot of our members live in and around that area, and the operating engineers have been doing a lot of great work. It's a $1 billion type project right now to rebuild that. So that's great, right? But that doesn't mean that that operating engineer is going to stay working on that dam forever. They're going to have to travel to where the work is. So that's just the nature of the industry.
Thank you, Cesar. We're going to end with that. Please help me say thank you to our panelists. And I know later in the afternoon, there will be some more specific panels that will address issues like the scoping plan in the ag sector, the low carbon fuel standard as well, baseload energy, and many other specific issues. So once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to facilitate this conversation. You all have a wonderful day.